Hello, I'm Michael Morris. I'd like to join in welcoming you to this year's rather unusual joint session on behalf of the Mind Association. I might have expected to be speaking to you in a large lecture theatre in Kent, whereas in fact I'm speaking to you from my front room in Sussex. It would have been a kind of stage performance, but it's going to be a sort of fireside chat. Slightly inept, I'll just be using some very basic PowerPoint slides with some pictures thrown in. Art and metaphysics. And here's a picture. This is a painting of the Sussex Downs, just a few miles from where I'm sitting now, by Eric Ravilius, who was brought up in Sussex and often came back to visit here, particularly in the 1930s. And what I want to do here is to defend a proposition, a thesis, which I think everybody who cares about art believes in. That's artists and most people who are concerned with it. Whatever official justification they may give, whatever they like to say to tell themselves, this, I think, is what they really believe in. It's this, that one of the principal functions of representational art is to enable us to understand the world as it is in itself, in a particular distinctive way. Well, let's unpack that a bit. The world, what does that mean? I think it's a kind of schematic phrase. It's schematic for whatever it is that our thoughts and representations are about, at least when they're about something real, okay? So it's what, that's what it means. It just is whatever we're thinking about or describing or representing. So, for example, if we're thinking about the mind becomes part of the world. That's how it goes. Well, what about that phrase, as it is in itself? What is the world as it is in itself? I take it to be the world as it is, altogether independently of any relation to any thought or representation of it. Of course, our understanding can't be independent of any thought or representation, but the idea is the object of our understanding might be. And I think that's the object of art. Art is concerned to help us to understand the world as it is in itself, wholly independently of any relation to thought or understanding. Now, at first, I just want to deal with a couple of problems about that, which I'm just going to set aside. The first worry is that you might think that art only deals with the appearance of things. So, for example, representational painting only shows the look of things. And you might think that that stops art showing things as they are altogether independently of any relation to thought or representation. Because you might think the appearance of things is something kind of relative to perception. But I think that's not obviously true. So I think that perceptible qualities, for example, visible qualities, don't have to be thought of as perception relative. They might be the way things objectively are, which happens to be visible, for example, to one particular sense modality. That's a problem. I'm not going to actually pursue it here, but I just mention it. And here's another as well. Sometimes people think that the way things are in themselves somehow is the way they are most fundamentally. And there's a large tendency to think that the way things are most fundamentally is understood by understanding how they work. That is to say, understanding their causal roles, what causes them, what effects they have, and things like that. And it's surely true that art can't reveal that sort of thing. To that I want to say, I accept that that is a very fundamental kind of understanding, and I don't want to claim that the understanding provided by art is more fundamental than that, but I think it may be as fundamental. I think art is deep in a way that's different from, rather than in competition with, the understanding provided by causal science. I just mentioned that and set it aside. I won't be dealing with it here. There'll be plenty of other things to talk about. So there's the claim. I want to claim that one of the principal functions of representational art is to enable us to understand the world as it is in itself, in a particular distinctive way. And I've highlighted principal functions there because I'm now going to explain what that means. Well, the first thing is obviously to be a principal function, it must at least be a function of the thing. And that means, I think, that it has to be one of the things that the thing is built for. It must be built into it, built into the point of it, that it does that, or that it can be used like that. It's not just something that might be, it might be adventitiously used for. So it got to be part of the point of the thing. But I don't think that's enough for the idea of a principal function, and it's not the idea enough for what we really care about if we're trying to defend the claim that the point of art or something like that is to help us understand the world. What we want, I think, is a kind of function which only that thing can perform, which gives us reason to turn to that rather than anything else. Okay, so there may be some functions that things have which are perfectly well performed by other things, and then you could choose any one of them, right? But I think what we're interested in art is something which only art can provide. Okay, and that's what I mean by a principal function. It's a function, but it's a function that only art can provide. Okay, and that has some consequences. So, for example, it looks as if it can't be the principal function, a principal function of art, to do something which a drug could do, just calm you down at the end of the day, or hype you up, or something like that. Okay. Similarly, it can't be a principal function of art to do what psychology could do, tell you how people think, perhaps, or what history could do to tell you the facts about what really happened. I think actually we could go further than that. It looks as if it can't be a principal function of art to do something which a careful set of instructions could get you to do. That is, for example, to get you to imagine something. That looks like it's something that a careful set of instructions could do, and it's not obvious why you need art for it. Well then, I'm talking about representational art, and we're looking to find out what distinctive thing it does. So what's special about it? So here are two very obvious things. First of all, representational art, I think this is uncontroversial, but perhaps someone might doubt it, involves the use of a medium in this very minimal and basic sense. It involves the use of something which the artist deliberately manipulates in order to portray something, to represent something. That might be oil paint, which they could do with a brush or a palette knife. It could be stone, which they carve with a chisel, or it could be words, if it's a novelist. So that's one thing. And the other thing, obviously, to be representational, it has to have something which we might call content. And here I'm going to take a very particular view of what I'm talking about, the content. I'm talking about what some people might think of as the objects of art, the things you encounter in it. So what I'm thinking of as the content of a work of art is the people you might encounter in it, the scenes you might encounter in it, the events which you might encounter in it, okay? So that might be the face you see in a portrait, or the hills in the landscape, like that one I showed earlier on, or the life of a person that you come across in a novel. These are the things that the novel presents to you, okay? And that's what I mean by the content. Now, if you have those in mind, I think there's a very distinctive thing that's important about representational art. I think other people have had a go moving towards this thesis, including someone I'll mention later, but it's, I think, not been clearly formulated before. It's what I call the non-distraction thesis. It's this, that attending to the medium of a representational work can't inevitably be a distraction from attending to its content, or vice versa. So you can attend to the medium in a way which would distract you from the content, make you see it less well. But it must be possible to be aware of the medium without being less aware or aware less well of the content, okay? That's, I think, a really, really important thesis about representational art. The brief argument for it is this: if it weren't true, it'd be very hard to understand how some of the things that we think are routinely possible and performed in fairly straightforward ways could not be done, at least in those ways. So it would be impossible, if this were not true, for the artist to produce a representational work in any ordinary way, because what they need to do is to work the medium to produce the content. But how are they going to do that if the moment they look at the medium, they're confused about the content, or they can't see the content properly? It would also be impossible in any ordinary way to look at the work critically and find out how it's done, how the content has been worked out, produced in the medium, okay? And similarly, it will be impossible, at least in the ordinary way that we do, to like or dislike the way the content has been shaped in the medium, okay? Those are arguments for accepting what I think is an absolutely fundamental thesis about representational art. And this is a sculpture I actually don't like very much. Rodin's Kiss, this is the version of it that you find in the Musée Rodin in Paris, okay? And here, you look at this, you can't but see both the content and the medium. So you can see a pair of lovers here, and at the same time, you can't but see the stone that they're carved out of, okay? That's absolutely integral to all representational art. The reason I don't like it is there's something I don't like about the way the medium has been worked, and it's a bit difficult to put my finger on it. Okay, so it's going to be required that somehow or other, all proper attention to representational art involves a kind of integrated engagement with both the medium and the content in that sense. How that's possible, well, I have a theory about, but we don't need to worry about it now. Okay. So that's what we need. If we take that thesis seriously, we need a proper integrated engagement. Now, why should that be important? Why should that be important? I think a way of getting a key to that is to think about the notion of composition as we think of it, artistic composition, composition in painting and drawing, okay? Well, what is it? One thing it's not, I think, is something which is intelligible in terms of separate from content. Some people think that composition is about form, and they think that form is to be contrasted with content. And I think that's wrong about composition, and it's wrong about form. I think composition is only intelligible as the arrangement or shape of the content. It's a matter of putting the content within the picture or space in a paper and drawing, okay? So it's positioning and shaping the people, the trees, the bridges, the clouds, whatever you have in a painting, within the shape, the space of the painting or drawing, okay? And I'm going to try to illustrate that with this rather amazing picture. This is by Roy Lichtenstein. It's called Madame Cézanne, and it's a copy, if you like. It's a parody of a compositional diagram by someone called Earl Lauren, which aims to explain how a famous painting by Cézanne of his wife works. And of course, you look at it like this, doesn't mean anything. And of course, it only means something at all because you can't help seeing the outline there as, in fact, the outline of a woman in a painting. Otherwise, the shapes are of no importance. That's why composition is, in fact, always about putting the things in the picture in particular places. Now, if you have that very general notion of composition, okay, that it's the arrangement of the things in a painting or a drawing within the picture space, you can see how that can generalize. It looks as if you can talk about the arrangement of the content of a work within the space of the work. And that looks as if it's going to be an issue for every representational art form. Very obviously in photography, there's a lovely picture by Kertész of I think Montmartre Summer in Paris. And there are things to note about this. This is obviously a compositional thing. You'll look immediately at the lines, but notice also the fact that the woman at the bottom there is very slightly out of focus. That's a compositional decision, I think. Okay. You can also find it in a different way in sculpture. Sculpture always has to be somewhere, actual sculpture, and it's going to then be looked at from a certain point of view or range of points of view, and that's going to make a difference to how the whole thing looks. That's a kind of way of using an existing environment as part of the composition of sculpture. And here's a famous one. It's Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North in the northeast of England. You can see its position above a road on a little hill, and that position is essential to the way that that piece works, okay? So there's a kind of sense in which you make sense of composition there. Quite importantly, the scale of the thing is crucial to the work it does there. And that's, I think, general for sculpture. and probably for all works where their actual size is important, paintings included. It's obviously also an issue in writing. We're talking about the arrangement of the things that you might encounter in a novel, for example, within the whole. So the question of how to order events, how long to spend on particular scenes, when to introduce characters, all that sort of thing, how long the book should be, all of those things are compositional issues, I think. Okay. So I've just said that composition applies to all representational art forms. I'm now going to make a claim, doesn't really matter, but I think it's a good claim, that actually composition is of fundamental importance in all art forms. I'm inclined to think even that every working decision, that is every decision that the artist makes once the basic outline of the subject matter has been decided on, from there on, every decision is a compositional decision, whether on a small or a large scale. I'm really tempted by that thesis. Okay, and if you think about the choices that a painter makes once they've decided what the subject matter is going to be, what a sculptor does, what a photographer does, what a novelist does, it's really not a silly thought to think that they're fundamentally compositional choices. Well then, okay, so that's a distinctive thing about art. We have this non-distraction thesis, and the non-distraction thesis is important because we can see it's important because it's connected with composition. Composition is always about positioning things within the space, so the content within the medium, if you like. Okay. Now the question is, why does composition matter? Why is that important? And I think the answer is really simply because art isn't everything. Art is not the whole of life, and this is a really fundamental fact about art. There are other things we do. We eat. We prepare food. We clear our houses out, or maybe we don't, depending on how tidily we live. Art isn't the whole of our lives. That means it's always in some way confined. It must always be possible to turn away from art, to move on from it, to have done with it, at least for a while. And that means that every art form has to contain within itself, at its very heart, the means of leaving it. And composition is just the business of handling the boundaries which that confinement makes essential. Nevertheless, of course, although you want to have a means of leaving art, you still want to keep people in, okay? So you want art to hold you while it can and to make you return to it, even if only in memory. So how does this work? Well, I think it goes like this. What is it that holds one in? I think it goes like this, basically. Everything you encounter in a representational work is, I think, in some way worked in a deliberately manipulated medium. That comes out of the non-distraction thesis. Everything you encounter there, people, scenes, events, landscapes, they're worked in this deliberately manipulated medium. And it's really important that the medium is deliberately manipulated, because what that means is that everything about the way the things you come across within the work presents itself as in the work as it is for a reason. Okay? And that means that roughly rationalism applies to works of art, at least to good works of art. For everything you find there in a good work of art, there's a reason why it is as it is, rather than otherwise. And because there's a reason for everything there, we can always ask what the reason is. Well, schematically, I think the reason will be compositional, broadly speaking. It'll be because of what it contributes to the whole, given the general purpose of the whole. And working out what each thing contributes is what holds you when you look at a work of art. You're trying to work out, I think, how each bit contributes to the whole. So now we've got every work of art, representational art, containing both something to let you turn away from it and something to keep you there. The first thing I think is, I call it resolution. Okay, it's a kind of rounding off, even if it's an abrupt rounding off. It's what makes a painted scene fit the frame of a painting or the bit of wall that's been assigned for it. It's what enables a curtain to be brought down at the end of a stage performance. Okay, that's what composition is about, rounding things off, making them fit in some way the space. And the second thing that's important about art is what it is that makes you linger. And it's the reason each thing is where it is and as it is. Okay, so that's all that. But now let's go back to what I was trying to argue for. The thesis that one of the principal functions of representational art is to enable us to understand the world as it is in itself in a particular distinctive way. And I've tried to convince you or say that what's really important is that we focus on the medium embodied content of a representational work and understand its composition. Okay, and we've got all that. Well, how's that connected with the real world? That's the real question. And here I'm going to move to a very obvious thing. This is Richard Wollheim's notion of seeing in. This notion was in fact designed to do something which I think it absolutely can't do, for a reason I'll explain in a moment, which I think the non-distraction thesis really does. But its core idea is it's used to describe what's involved in, as it were, appreciating that a painting, in the particular case he begins with, is a painting of what it's a painting of, that it's a portrait with a face in it, for example, okay? And the idea is that you can see a face in the painting, perhaps sometimes in the paint, okay? Well, this notion of seeing in is used in two particular ways, sometimes to describe Wollheim's own particular theory, and sometimes to describe a whole range of theories, including Wollheim's, but also including Gombrich's, which Wollheim was trying to reject, and Walton's, which is a kind of rejection of, improvement upon Wollheim's. And actually it's also used to describe other theories like resemblance theories, which say that what you do is you see a part of the surface of a painting as resembling some real object, okay? But I'll use that general use. I'll just talk about seeing in that most general way, covering not only Wollheim's theory, but all these others. Now, this is a thing which I think is true of this. If you think what's going on here, the idea that you have here is that when you see a person in the paint of a painting, what you see in the paint of a painting is a real person. If not a particular real person, at least a kind of real person. This is really important. Okay, I'll come to it in a moment. That's shared by all of the theories I've just mentioned. So Wollheim thinks the distinctive thing about seeing in is that it brings of that somehow or other visions of things present, the paint, bring about visions of things absent. But if they're absent, why are they absent? Because they're real people or whatever. Okay, that you might see there. Gombrich, he thinks that when you look at a painting of a person, ideally you're under the illusion that you're seeing a person. In that case, it must be a real person that you're under the illusion that you're seeing. And similarly, Walton is absolutely clear that when you see a mill, for example, in a painting of a mill, you make believe that what you're seeing when you look at the painting is a real mill, okay? So what this means is, in general, if you see X in Y, in the sense that applies to all these theories, X will be a real thing of its kind, an experience of which we will in some way import into our experience of Y, the paint, whatever it might be, okay? Well, if you've got that very general idea, you can see that it can generalize all across all the arts. You can talk of seeing a person in a novel, or finding a person in a novel, encountering a person in a novel, as well as seeing someone in a sculpture, a drawing, or a photograph. In all cases, what happens here is that in some way, you're bringing the real world into the work of art, if you like, projecting perhaps, or comparing the real world as being brought to bear on the work of art, okay? And that looks like a way of connecting the work of art with the real world. And that might make it seem a a model for how representational art might enable to understand the world as it is in itself. But I think there are two reasons against going that way. One of them, and this is why I think Boheim's got things wrong, is that seeing in is very hard to square with the non-distraction thesis. Because if the business of looking at painting is somehow to see a real person there, then the medium is bound to be a distraction. Because real people are not generally composed of or draped in or whatever paint. Attending to the paint stops you seeing them as real, okay? And something like that will carry across to all representational art forms, I think. The moment you try to think that what you're encountering is a real person, you have to forget the actual medium, okay? And that means, I think, that if you take this line, you have to forget you're unable to treat representational art properly as art, and therefore you're unable to treat find the thing which is really distinctive about what art can provide. There's also another very simple thought. I think this model, the seeing in model, as I've characterized it, gets things the wrong way around. As I've said, what it does is, on the whole, brings the real world into painting. The general idea of it was that we're supposed to be confronted with a mystery. How is it that, as it were, we see a face, for example, in a painting, when there's no face there, they say? Well, we then tell a funny story. We understand what seeing real person is, and so we kind of connect seeing the painting with that. Okay, so we suppose the unproblematic case is seeing the real person, and we apply that to seeing, understanding the painting. So we're using the real world to make sense of art. Okay, but that's clearly the wrong direction for what I'm after, because what I'm trying to understand is how we can use art to understand the real world. Okay, so I'm going to try inverting the model. Let's talk about inverted seeing in. Okay, just suppose that somehow or other we already understand how it is that we can encounter a person or a sky or something in a work of art in a way that respects the non-distraction thesis. Okay. And then I suggest that what we do is we transfer that understanding, that conception, to the real world, okay? So the idea would be that having seen a painting, we invertedly see a painted person in a real person. Having seen a painted scene, we invertedly see that scene in a real one, okay? We see something composed in a world that is not itself composed. Okay, now that's a Poussin, a bit of a detail of a Poussin in the National Gallery in London, and that's a Poussin sky. And I think it's a reasonably common experience to see a sky, if you've seen a bit of Poussin, to see a sky, and you suddenly, as it were, see Poussin in it. It looks as if it's been composed like Poussin, something like that. Okay, and that's the not uncommon experience. Okay, and I think once you've got the idea of inverted seeing in, which is seeing a work of art in the real world, you can then make sense of a different way of looking at works of art in a way that works there. So you might look at a Rembrandt portrait, actually look at the portrait, and in looking at the portrait, see how that face, the one in the painting, might be invertedly seen in a real face. Okay, if the painting reminds you of a particular person, then suddenly you can, as it were, invertedly see that. Because of that, you can see the real person, particular person, in a new way. If a kind of person, if it reminds you of a kind of person, then you'll see that kind of person in a different way. They'll have the shape of them. Okay, and there's a detail of a Rembrandt portrait, Margrethe de Geer, in the National Gallery, and there's a woman there, and you can imagine, having looked at that painting, seeing the wrinkles on a woman's forehead as painted. You could just see them there. Suddenly they're there, they've been laid on. You could imagine that, I think, right? Okay, the moment you look at that, you can see how you could see a woman of that sort in that way. Now, I just talked about paintings, but you can generalize that in obvious ways. So you might be listening to a really strange, tense conversation, and it might just strike you as if it was, as it were, a stretch of dialogue by Ivy Compton Burnett. So you'd be finding Compton Burnett in a real conversation. And conversely, you might be at an opera watching some particular scene, and the moment you think of that scene, you can see how you might reconceive bits of everyday life composed as that scene in the opera is composed. Okay, so that's the idea. We're going to try the other way around, but now we've got to be a bit careful, because remember what I want to defend. It's one of the principal functions of representational art is to enable us to understand the world as it is in itself in a particular distinctive way. So how can that be done? How can invertedly seeing a painted face, carved torso, narrated life, or whatever in the world enable us to understand the world as it is in itself? And here are the obvious challenges. Basically, invertedly seeing artistically composed things in the world seems to be seeing the world exactly in terms of its relation to some particular form of representation. So how can that be helping us to understand it as it is in itself? And again, it seems to be seeing in the world things which aren't in the world in itself. So the world isn't made of stone, apart from the stone bits, or paint, apart from the painted bits, and it's not constructed in a narrative, and it's not in general artistically composed, unless you believe Genesis or something like that. And I'm afraid it's not subject to the principle of sufficient reason. So how can, as it were, transplanting painting to the real world enable one to understand the real world? The problem briefly is this: it looks like invertedly seeing works of art in the world is inevitably to be understood in terms of the familiar metaphor of projection, that we project something onto the world which isn't really there. So how can that be understanding the world as it is in itself? Well, I think the problem here is a certain model of understanding. We're inclined to think that understanding something is simply finding something in it which is already there. And if we have that model, it looks as if we'd have to think that the kind of understanding provided by art would come in the following two stages. First, what we do is impose, project something artistically composed onto the real world. And secondly, having projected it there, we find it there. So we somehow seeing art in the world will then somehow involve both these stages, projecting out and amazingly finding it there and reading it back. And that's going to be just useless, okay, right? Now, actually, it's worth mentioning that this kind of thinking can be found elsewhere, in a very particular case in particular. We sometimes think that when we think, we conceptualize the world. And by conceptualize it, transform it. The world becomes conceptualized. Somehow or other, we begin with a non-conceptual world and reshape it. You know the metaphors. Most famous metaphor here is the idea of our categories carving up reality, as if the categories might actually change anything. But there's something very odd about that picture, because when you, as it were, conceptualize a thing, you don't change it. And if you really want to carve, you need a knife, obviously. So what's going on? I think it's a mistaken image based on this other model of understanding, of simply finding something there. Okay. So now I'm going to suggest an alternative model of understanding, and I think it's a really familiar one. It's found in the everyday notion of grasp or comprehension, or capture, if you like. It's all over the place. Lots of languages have something like this. Now, grasping isn't itself knowing facts or recognizing any feature of things which is there already, although no doubt it will depend upon knowing some facts and recognizing some features, and will almost certainly issue in further knowledge of facts and further recognition of features. But the grasp itself is not that. What the grasp is, as the metaphor suggests, it's a kind of taking what you find in front of you together, a kind of mental as it were, arranging of things. Okay? Well, you know what I'm going to say. Okay? It's, of course, not just any kind of arrangement, absolutely not an arbitrary scattering. What it obviously is, surely, is a kind of mental, artistic composition, an arrangement of things with a view to resolution, to tidying them up, sorting them out, making it possible to move on from them. Okay? But obviously it's only a mental resolution of them, an arrangement in the mind, because nothing in the world is actually moved or reshaped. So here's the suggestion. Invertedly seeing art in the world allows us to treat the real world rather as, not precisely as, but rather as we treat a representational work of art. It allows us to study it and then move on and still return to it again. It encourages us to treat all of its features as if they were there for a reason, and that keeps our attention on them and makes us wonder what they're doing in their coordination with each other, and it pushes us to look again at what they are. That's what it makes us do, but we can do this, I think, and we habitually do, while never really forgetting that what we're looking at is not in fact a work of art, is not in fact composed, is not in fact made of paint or narrative or anything like that. So how does this count as understanding? Well, I think roughly a state or activity counts as understanding the world in virtue of two things. First, it must be sensitive to the way the world actually is, and second, it must do something appropriate with that sensitivity. Simply finding something in the world which is already there is one way of meeting the first condition. And if that's how you meet the first condition, you'd expect something like recording the findings or something like that to be the way the second condition is met. What I want is to suggest that grasping can meet those two conditions without being a matter of simply finding. So the first thing is it does look as if it's sensitive to the way the world really is. You can't just see just any work of art in just any real situation or any real thing. You can't see a Poussin sky in a dark cupboard, okay? Invertedly, that is. So inverted seeing in the world already meets the first condition, that it's sensitive to the way the world is. And I think what it does with that sensitivity is enable us to see what's there, the real world, which constrains the inverted seeing in. And it, rather as if it were artistically composed. And that in turn, I think, enables us to come to terms with it, with the world, to face up to it precisely as it is in itself, to hold it in mind, but also to move on from it. And I think that's that thing, facing up to it, looking at it again, holding it in mind, and being able to move on. That's how inverted seeing in meets the second condition of doing something appropriate. Is this useful? Maybe, but that's not the point. The idea is that the whole point is that art here enables us to come to terms with the world by enabling us to grasp it and to face up to it as it is in itself. And I think that's its final goal. Now, there is a kind of pleasure in art. I think it's a kind of satisfaction, sometimes a kind of peace that people feel when they faced up to the world in the kind of way that art enables them to do. And sometimes people might think that that feeling is what the art's about, is to give us a kind of pleasure, but I don't think that's right. I think the goal is enabling us to understand the world, to face up to it, to accept it on its own terms. And the satisfaction, the sense of peace, is a kind of recognition that that goal has been achieved, but it's not the goal. And I think that means that we can give representational art its due by thinking of it as enabling us to grasp, comprehend, or capture the world, by treating the world rather as if it were artistically composed in the various ways which different kinds of art enable us to do. This obviously isn't just finding in the world something which is already there, and it obviously isn't a matter of reshaping the world. But I think it's enough to be a way of understanding the world as it is in itself. And then I'll leave you with a picture. This is not a painting, it's a photograph from another of my lovely Sussex hills, similar sort of distance away from us in a slightly different direction. Again, I'm going to do that and then wish you well. And I'll look forward to responding to any questions you may have.